What if I told you that while Alex Murdaugh was busy murdering his wife and son to cover his tracks, he had already been running one of the most audacious financial fraud schemes in American legal history? What if I told you that for nearly 2 decades, this man didn't just steal millions from grieving families at their most vulnerable moments, but built an entire empire of lies that would make Bernie Madoff blush? And what if I told you that the very people who trusted him most, the clients who came to him broken and desperate for justice, became his primary victims in a web of deception so twisted that it spans generations of pain? If you're new to Dark Trail Files, you're about to dive deep into one of the most complex criminal cases of our time. This channel is dedicated to uncovering the darkest stories that mainstream media won't touch and bringing you the facts that others are afraid to tell. Make sure you hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell, because we're just getting started. Now, before we dive into today's story, if you haven't watched my previous episodes on the Murdaugh murders and the Buster Murdaugh investigation, I strongly recommend you go back and watch those first. This financial crimes case is intimately connected to everything we've already covered, and understanding Alex's desperate financial situation is crucial to comprehending why he ultimately murdered his own family. Those episodes will give you the foundation you need to fully appreciate the scope of what we're about to uncover today. The story of Alex Murdaugh's financial crimes begins long before that fateful night in June 2021 when he executed his wife Maggie and son Paul at their hunting lodge. In fact, the seeds of this devastating fraud were planted nearly 2 decades earlier, in 2005, when a seemingly respected attorney from one of South Carolina's most powerful legal dynasties made a decision that would eventually destroy everything he touched. Picture this. You're dealing with the worst tragedy of your life. Maybe you've lost a loved one in a horrific accident. Maybe you've been catastrophically injured and facing mountains of medical bills. You're vulnerable, broken, and desperate for someone to fight for you. Then along comes Alex Murdaugh, heir to a century-long legal legacy, promising to make things right. His family name carries weight that spans generations. His grandfather, father, and great-grandfather all served as prosecutors in the same judicial circuit for over 80 years. When Alex Murdaugh tells you he'll take care of everything, you believe him. You trust him with your life savings, your settlement money, your future. And that's exactly when he strikes. For 18 years, from 2005 to 2023, Alex Murdaugh systematically looted millions of dollars from the very people who trusted him most. This wasn't a crime of passion or a momentary lapse in judgment. This was a calculated, methodical campaign of financial terrorism against some of society's most vulnerable individuals. He didn't just steal money. He stole hope, dignity, and justice from people who had already lost everything. The scope of his theft is staggering. Federal prosecutors revealed that Murdaugh stole approximately $8.7 million from his clients and his own law firm. But the real number could be even higher, because Alex Murdaugh was so skilled at covering his tracks that investigators are still uncovering new victims and new schemes years after his arrest. Let me paint you a picture of how this monster operated. Murdaugh would take on cases for clients who had suffered devastating losses, accidents that left them paralyzed, deaths that tore families apart, injuries that destroyed lives. He would work these cases, sometimes for years, building trust and rapport with families who saw him as their salvation. Then, when settlement negotiations concluded, when insurance companies agreed to pay out hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars in compensation, Alex Murdaugh would perform his most evil trick. He would tell his clients that the settlement was much smaller than it actually was, sometimes a fraction of the real amount. Or he would claim that legal fees and expenses ate up most of the money. Or he would simply forge documents and signatures, creating fake legal papers that showed the money going to places it never went. Then he would steal the difference, funneling the money into his personal accounts to feed his drug addiction, pay his massive debts, and maintain the lavish lifestyle that kept the Murdaugh name synonymous with power and prestige. The case that best illustrates the depths of his depravity involves Gloria Satterfield, the Murdaugh family's housekeeper and nanny for over 20 years. Gloria wasn't just an employee, she was practically family. She had watched Alex's children grow up, had been there through birthdays and holidays, had cleaned their messes, and cooked their meals with the devotion of a grandmother. In February 2018, Gloria suffered a fatal fall at the Murdaugh property. She died from her injuries, leaving behind 2 sons who had just lost the most important person in their lives. But Alex Murdaugh saw opportunity in their grief. Instead of honoring the memory of a woman who had served his family faithfully for decades, he immediately began plotting to steal from her grieving children. Murdaugh approached Gloria's sons and convinced them to file a wrongful death lawsuit against his own homeowners' insurance policies. He promised to help them get justice for their mother's death. He assured them he would make sure they were taken care of. He even recommended they hire his close friend, attorney Corey Fleming, to represent them in the case. What the Satterfield brothers didn't know was that Alex Murdaugh and Corey Fleming were already conspiring to rob them blind. The insurance companies ultimately agreed to pay out $4.3 million to settle the wrongful death claim. For $0.3 million that should have gone to 2 sons who had just lost their mother, money that could have secured their futures and honored Gloria's memory. Instead, Alex Murdaugh and his co-conspirator Corey Fleming stole virtually every penny. Here's how they did it. Murdaugh and Fleming created a fake bank account using a name that sounded official, something the Satterfield brothers would never question. They told the insurance companies to deposit the settlement money into this fraudulent account. Then they simply took the money and split it between themselves, leaving Gloria Satterfield's sons with nothing. Not only did they steal the settlement money, but they never even told the brothers that a settlement had been reached. For years, Tony and Brian Satterfield believed their case was still pending, that justice for their mother was still coming. They had no idea that millions of dollars rightfully theirs had been stolen while they struggled financially, still grieving the loss of the woman who had raised them. The cruelty of this scheme cannot be overstated. Gloria Satterfield had devoted more than 20 years of her life to caring for the Murdaugh family. She had been there when Alex's children were born, had comforted them when they were sick, had been a constant presence of love and stability in their lives. And when she died, while working on their property, Alex Murdaugh repaid that loyalty by stealing from her children. He literally profited from the death of a woman who had treated his family like her own. But the Satterfield case was just the beginning. Alex Murdaugh's theft operation was like a malignant tumor, growing larger and more aggressive with each victim. He stole from the estate of Hakeem Pinkney, a deaf client who died in a train accident. He took money from Natasha Thomas, whose husband was killed in a workplace accident. He robbed Donna Badger, who was catastrophically injured in a car crash. He even stole from his own law firm's clients, including a settlement for a man who lost his leg in an accident. The methods Murdaugh used to steal this money were as varied as they were cruel. Sometimes he would simply lie about settlement amounts, telling clients they were receiving much less than the actual payout. Other times, he would create fake legal expenses, claiming that court costs and attorney fees consumed most of the settlement money. In some cases, he would forge clients' signatures on legal documents, authorizing the transfer of settlement funds to accounts he controlled. And in the most audacious instances, he would create entirely fictitious legal entities, fake businesses, and fake bank accounts that existed solely to funnel stolen money into his personal finances. One of his most insidious tactics involved exploiting the trust his clients placed in him as their attorney. Many of his victims were unsophisticated in legal matters, people who had never dealt with the court system before and relied entirely on Murdaugh's expertise to guide them through the process. When he told them that their settlement was a certain amount, they believed him. When he explained that legal fees would reduce their payout, they accepted his word. When he handed them documents to sign, they signed without question, trusting that their attorney was looking out for their best interests. This trust was systematically weaponized against every single victim. Murdaugh would cultivate relationships with these families over months or years, attending family gatherings, sending Christmas cards, positioning himself as not just their lawyer, but their friend and advocate. He would learn intimate details about their financial struggles, their hopes for the future, their plans for how settlement money would change their lives. Then he would use that knowledge to craft lies that seemed believable, explanations for why their settlements were smaller than expected that played on their lack of legal knowledge and their faith in his integrity. The financial pressure driving these crimes was immense and growing year by year. Alex Murdaugh was spending money at an astronomical rate, burned through hundreds of thousands of dollars annually to feed a massive opioid addiction that consumed up to 60 pills a day. His drug habit wasn't just expensive. It was all-consuming, affecting his judgment, his ability to practice law, and his capacity to maintain the facade of success that the Murdaugh name demanded. But the drugs were only part of the financial equation. Murdaugh was also maintaining an extraordinarily expensive lifestyle that included multiple properties, luxury vehicles, private school tuition, country club memberships, and the kind of social obligations that come with being part of South Carolina's legal elite. The pressure to maintain appearances, to uphold the Murdaugh family reputation, created a financial burden that legitimate income couldn't support. As his theft operation expanded, Murdaugh became increasingly desperate and reckless. He began stealing from his own law firm, Peters, Murdaugh, Parker, Elsroth, and Dietrich, taking money directly from client settlements that the firm was handling. He forged checks, manipulated financial records, and created fake invoices to justify transfers of money into his personal accounts. When partners at the firm began asking questions about missing funds, Murdaugh would create elaborate explanations, blaming clerical errors or delayed payments from insurance companies. The stealing became an addiction unto itself, a compulsive behavior that Murdaugh couldn't stop even as the risks grew more severe. Each theft required new lies to cover previous lies. Each stolen dollar demanded the theft of 10 more to maintain the deception. By 2020 and 2021, Murdaugh was stealing money almost continuously, taking funds from multiple clients simultaneously while desperately trying to juggle the various fraud schemes that were beginning to collapse around him. The wall started closing in during the spring of 2021, just months before Murdaugh would murder his wife and son. Partners at his law firm were conducting an internal investigation into missing client funds, and they were specifically focusing on Murdaugh's handling of settlement money. The firm's financial officers had noticed discrepancies in client accounts, missing money that should have been there, and transfers that didn't match any legitimate legal work. At the same time, investigators were beginning to ask questions about the glorious Satterfields settlement, prompted by a lawsuit filed by her sons after they learned that their mother's death had resulted in a multi-million-dollar insurance payout they had never received. The Satterfield brothers had finally discovered that Alex Murdaugh had been lying to them for years, that their mother's death had generated millions of dollars in settlement money that had simply vanished. Financial pressure wasn't just mounting, it was becoming existential. Murdaugh owed money to drug dealers, money to creditors, money to clients whose settlements he had already spent. His law firm was demanding answers about missing funds, and state investigators were beginning to examine his financial records. For a man who had spent 18 years believing he was untouchable, the reality that his crimes were about to be exposed created a level of desperation that ultimately led to murder. The connection between Murdaugh's financial crimes and the murders of Maggie and Paul is not speculative, it's mathematical. Prosecutors demonstrated that Murdaugh killed his family on June 7, 2021, just one day before a hearing that would have exposed his theft from the Satterfield family. He murdered his wife and son to create a distraction, to generate sympathy, and to delay the financial reckoning that was about to destroy him. But even murder wasn't enough to save Alex Murdaugh from the consequences of his financial crimes. Within months of the killings, investigators had uncovered the full scope of his theft operation. Client after client came forward with stories of stolen settlement money, forged documents, and lies that had cost them hundreds of thousands of dollars. The law firm that had employed Murdaugh for decades was forced to confront the reality that one of their partners had been systematically looting client funds for nearly 20 years. The victims of Murdaugh's financial crimes represent a cross-section of human tragedy. There was Pamela Pinckney, whose son Hakeem was killed when his car stalled on railroad tracks and was struck by a train. Murdaugh stole over $400,000 from Hakeem's estate, money that was supposed to provide for Pamela in her old age. There was Arthur Badger, who became a paraplegic after a devastating car accident and trusted Murdaugh to secure his financial future, only to have hundreds of thousands of dollars stolen from a settlement. There was Natasha Thomas, whose husband died in a workplace accident, leaving her to raise their children alone. Murdaugh told her that her wrongful death settlement was much smaller than it actually was, pocketing the difference while she struggled to pay bills and care for her family. There was Jordan Jinks, who was severely injured in a car accident and needed money for medical treatments and long-term care, money that Murdaugh diverted into his own accounts instead. Each of these victims represents not just a financial crime, but a profound betrayal of human trust. These people came to Murdaugh at the worst moments of their lives, when they were broken, desperate, and completely dependent on his expertise and integrity. They trusted him with their futures, their family's security, their hope for justice. And he repaid that trust by stealing from them while they grieved, while they recovered, while they tried to rebuild their lives after devastating losses. The psychological impact of these crimes extends far beyond the financial losses. Many of Murdaugh's victims described feeling not just robbed, but violated in the most intimate way possible. They had shared their deepest pain with this man, had relied on him to fight for them when they couldn't fight for themselves, had believed that he cared about their suffering and their future. Learning that he had been stealing from them all along created a second trauma, a betrayal so complete that many victims described it as worse than their original injuries or losses. When Alex Murdaugh finally faced his victims in court during his sentencing hearings, the testimonies were devastating. Tony Satterfield, Gloria's son, looked directly at the man who had stolen millions from his mother's estate and said, "You lied, you cheated, you stole. You betrayed me and my family." He described years of financial struggle, years of believing that his mother's death meant nothing, years of wondering why the legal system had failed to provide justice for a woman who had devoted her life to caring for others. Other victims shared similar stories of betrayal and financial devastation. They described having to take second jobs to pay bills they thought settlement money would cover. They talked about medical treatments they couldn't afford, children's educations they couldn't fund, homes they lost because money they were counting on had been stolen by the man they trusted most. The technical details of how Murdaugh executed these thefts reveal a level of sophistication that took years to develop. He didn't just grab money and run. He created elaborate systems designed to hide his crimes for as long as possible. He would establish fake bank accounts using names that sounded legitimate, often incorporating legal-sounding terms that victims wouldn't question. He would forge legal documents, creating fake settlement agreements that showed smaller payouts than the actual amounts negotiated with insurance companies. In some cases, Murdaugh would collaborate with other attorneys, like Corey Fleming in the Satterfield case, to create the appearance of legitimate legal proceedings while actually orchestrating theft. Fleming would represent the victims while Murdaugh represented the defendants. And together they would craft settlement agreements that allowed them to steal the majority of the payout while leaving victims with just enough money to avoid immediate suspicion. Murdaugh also exploited his position within his law firm to facilitate these crimes. As a partner at Peters, Murdaugh, Parker, Eltroth, and Dietrich, he had access to client files, settlement negotiations, and financial records that allowed him to identify opportunities for theft. He could manipulate the firm's accounting systems to hide missing money, at least temporarily, and he could use the firm's reputation and resources to make his fraud schemes appear legitimate to outside observers. The drug addiction that partly motivated these crimes also helped explain how Murdaugh was able to maintain his deception for so long. People around him noticed changes in his behavior over the years, mood swings, and erratic decision-making that might have raised suspicions under normal circumstances. But because everyone knew about his addiction problems, these behavioral changes were attributed to drug use rather than criminal activity. His addiction became a kind of cover story that helped explain away inconsistencies in his conduct while allowing his theft operation to continue unchecked. By 2020 and 2021, Murdaugh's financial situation had become completely untenable. He was stealing money faster than he could cover his tracks, taking funds from multiple clients simultaneously while trying to manage an increasingly complex web of lies and forged documents. Bank records show that he was moving hundreds of thousands of dollars between accounts on a regular basis, desperately trying to stay ahead of questions from clients, colleagues, and investigators. The pressure reached a breaking point in early 2021 when multiple investigations began closing in simultaneously. His law firm was conducting an internal audit that had identified significant discrepancies in client accounts. The Satterfield family had hired new attorneys who were demanding answers about their mother's settlement. State investigators were beginning to examine Murdaugh's financial records in connection with other suspicious incidents. For the first time in 18 years, Alex Murdaugh faced the real possibility that his entire criminal operation would be exposed. It was this financial desperation, this imminent threat of exposure, that prosecutors argued drove Murdaugh to commit the ultimate crime. On June 7, 2021, facing a confrontation with his law firm partners about missing money and a hearing about the Satterfield settlement, Alex Murdaugh made the calculation that murdering his wife and son would buy him time, sympathy, and breathing room to continue his fraud operation. But murder only delayed the inevitable. Within months of killing Maggie and Paul, Murdaugh's financial crimes began unraveling at an accelerated pace. His law firm fired him and demanded repayment of stolen funds. Clients came forward with stories of missing settlement money and forged documents. State and federal investigators launched comprehensive examinations of his financial records that revealed the true scope of his criminal enterprise. The legal consequences for Murdaugh's financial crimes have been severe, though many argue they still don't match the magnitude of his offenses. In November 2023, he was sentenced to 27 years in state prison after pleading guilty to nearly 24 state financial crimes. Then, in April 2024, he received an additional 40 years in federal prison after pleading guilty to 22 federal charges, including conspiracy, wire fraud, bank fraud, and money laundering. These sentences will run concurrently with his life sentences for the murders of Maggie and Paul, meaning that even if his murder convictions were somehow overturned, Murdaugh would still spend the rest of his life in prison for his financial crimes alone. But for many of his victims, no amount of prison time can undo the damage he caused or restore what he stole from them. The financial crimes also revealed the broader corruption within South Carolina's legal system that allowed Murdaugh to operate unchecked for so long. His co-conspirator Corey Fleming, who helped steal millions from the Satterfield family, was sentenced to 46 months in federal prison. But Fleming was just one part of a larger network of attorneys, judges, and court officials who either participated in or turned a blind eye to obvious signs of financial misconduct. Even more disturbing were revelations about how some judges may have helped facilitate Murdaugh's crimes. Court documents suggest that certain judicial officials were aware of irregularities in settlement procedures, but failed to investigate or report suspicious activity. The system that was supposed to protect vulnerable clients instead enabled their victimization by one of the most trusted attorneys in the state. The psychological profile that emerges from studying Murdaugh's financial crimes is that of a man completely without empathy or conscience. He didn't steal from strangers or faceless corporations. He stole from people he knew personally, people whose children he had watched grow up, people who trusted him with their most intimate fears and hopes. He looked grieving mothers in the eye and lied about their settlements. He shook hands with paralyzed clients while planning to rob them of money they desperately needed for medical care. Perhaps most chilling is the realization that Murdaugh felt entitled to steal this money, that he viewed his clients' settlement funds as resources he could access whenever he needed cash. In recorded conversations with investigators, Murdaugh showed no genuine remorse for his theft, only regret that he had been caught. He seemed to believe that his family name, his legal expertise, and his personal charisma gave him the right to take whatever he wanted from people who couldn't fight back. The investigation into Murdaugh's financial crimes also revealed the sophisticated methods he used to launder stolen money and hide it from detection. He would move funds between multiple bank accounts, sometimes transferring money several times within a single day to obscure its origin. He would make cash withdrawals in amounts just below federal reporting requirements, avoiding the kind of documentation that might trigger regulatory scrutiny. Murdaugh also used his law firm's accounts as a vehicle for money laundering, depositing stolen client funds in firm accounts, and then writing checks to himself for fake legal expenses or fraudulent fee arrangements. This method allowed him to convert stolen money into apparently legitimate income, making it much harder for investigators to trace the funds back to their original victims. The scale of the money laundering operation suggests that Murdaugh was planning for the long term, building systems that would allow him to continue stealing for years or even decades without detection. He wasn't just taking money to solve immediate financial problems. He was constructing an entire parallel financial infrastructure designed to support a lifestyle built on theft and deception. When federal agents finally executed search warrants on Murdaugh's financial records, they uncovered evidence of criminal activity spanning nearly 2 decades. Bank records, legal documents, insurance claims, and client files painted a picture of systematic theft that touched virtually every aspect of Murdaugh's legal practice. Investigators found forged signatures, fabricated legal documents, fake settlement agreements, and fraudulent bank accounts that existed solely to facilitate theft for vulnerable clients. The financial crimes investigation also revealed the true extent of Murdaugh's drug addiction and how it intersected with his theft operation. Prosecutors determined that Murdaugh was spending approximately $50,000 per month on opioid pills, a habit that required him to maintain connections with multiple drug dealers and constantly search for new sources of cash to fund his purchases. But the drug addiction alone doesn't explain the scope or duration of Murdaugh's financial crimes. Even without his opioid habit, he was living far beyond his means, spending money on luxury items, real estate, and social obligations that his legitimate legal income couldn't support. The theft operation wasn't just about feeding an addiction. It was about maintaining a lifestyle and public image that required constant infusions of stolen cash. The investigation also uncovered evidence that Murdaugh's financial crimes may have been even more extensive than originally believed. Investigators found suspicious financial transactions dating back to the early 2000s, suggesting that his theft operation may have been active for over 20 years rather than the 18 years covered by the charges he ultimately pleaded guilty to. Some financial experts who studied Murdaugh's records believe that the $8.7 million he admitted to stealing represents only a fraction of his actual theft. They point to unexplained cash withdrawals, suspicious account transfers, and missing documentation that suggests additional victims and additional crimes that may never be fully uncovered. The ripple effects of Murdaugh's financial crimes extended far beyond his immediate victims. His law firm was forced to pay millions of dollars in restitution to clients he had robbed, costs that threatened the financial stability of an institution that had operated for over a century. Insurance companies that had paid out settlements to Murdaugh's fake accounts filed lawsuits, seeking to recover stolen funds, creating additional legal complications for victims who found themselves caught between competing claims for money that was rightfully theirs. The broader legal community in South Carolina was forced to confront uncomfortable questions about how such extensive financial crimes could continue for so long without detection. Bar associations implemented new oversight procedures for client settlement accounts, and courts established additional safeguards designed to prevent attorneys from stealing from the people they're supposed to protect. But for many observers, these institutional changes feel inadequate given the scale of what Murdaugh was able to accomplish. His crimes revealed systemic failures in legal oversight, judicial supervision, and professional accountability that allowed a predatory attorney to victimize vulnerable clients for nearly 2 decades without consequences. The human cost of Alex Murdaugh's financial crimes cannot be measured in dollars alone. His victims lost more than money. They lost faith in the legal system, faith in justice, faith in the idea that someone would fight for them when they couldn't fight for themselves. Many described feeling completely betrayed by a system they had trusted to protect them, questioning whether seeking legal help after their tragedies had only made their situations worse. For the families of Gloria Satterfield, the financial theft compounded their grief in ways that continue to affect them today. Not only did they lose a beloved mother and grandmother, but they discovered that the man she had served faithfully for over 20 years had repaid her loyalty by stealing from her children. The violation of trust was so complete, so personal, that it added an additional layer of trauma to an already devastating loss. As Alex Murdaugh begins serving what amounts to multiple life sentences for his various crimes, his victims continue dealing with the long-term consequences of his financial theft. Many are still fighting in court to recover stolen money, navigating complex legal proceedings to reclaim funds that were stolen years or even decades ago. Others have simply given up, concluding that the emotional cost of pursuing justice isn't worth the uncertain prospect of recovering money they may never see again. The Alex Murdaugh financial crimes case stands as one of the most comprehensive examples of attorney theft in American legal history. It demonstrates how a single individual, protected by family reputation and institutional connections, can systematically victimize dozens of people over many years while avoiding detection or accountability. Most importantly, it reveals the devastating human cost when the people we trust most to protect us become the ones who harm us. If this deep dive into Alex Murdaugh's financial crimes has left you wanting more, make sure you're subscribed to Dark Trail Files and hit that notification bell. We're not done with the Murdaugh story, not by a long shot. There are still connections to explore, still victims whose stories need to be told, still questions that demand answers. This is Dark Trail Files, where we follow the evidence wherever it leads, no matter how dark the trail becomes. Until next time, stay vigilant, stay informed, and never stop questioning the official narrative.